You're watching The Big Story. I'm Olivia Quay. Subscribe to the Straits Times channel so you never miss an episode. Singapore is in the middle of a COVID-19 wave. That's according to Health Minister Ong Ye Kung, who was speaking at a work plan seminar for the National Healthcare Group. The Health Ministry says that there was an estimated 4,000 daily infections last week, a jump from about 1,400 every day a month ago. Well, here's what we know about the current wave. Around 30% of current cases are reinfections as opposed to imported infections, even as Singapore welcomes more overseas visitors. And although numbers are rising, Mr. Ong says there's been no evidence showing that any of the current XBB strains cause more severe illnesses. At 220 over the past month, the number of hospitalized COVID-19 patients is far below the figures during Singapore's crisis period. ICU admissions also remaining stable and low, with fewer than 10 COVID patients at any one time in the past month. Mr. Ong says that this is what endemicity looks like. I quote, "What's happening is a clear demonstration of how far we have come. Even during a COVID-19 infection wave like now, we continue to live life normally, not preoccupied over infection numbers." Infections also rising in other countries in the region. Across the causeway, the COVID-19 positivity rate in Malaysia is also steeply increasing ahead of Hari Raya, with patient admissions surging by just over 17% in early April compared with March. The health ministry there, though, is saying that it's not taxing the healthcare system as hospitals are operating as per normal. Indonesia is too seeing a rising caseload in recent months after mobility curbs were eased, with daily infections reaching 987 earlier this week. While urging citizens to take their second booster shot, President Joko Widodo also says the country's high level of immunity means the situation is still well under control. Concerns among leading analysts of a technical recession, with Singapore's GDP growing just 0.1% year-on-year in the first quarter of 2023, dragged down by weakness in manufacturing. The Q1 growth is slower than the 2.1% expansion in the previous quarter. On a quarter-on-quarter seasonally adjusted basis, GDP contracting by 0.7%. By sector, manufacturing contracting by 6%, worsening from the 2.6% contraction in the quarter prior. It's due to shrinking output across all but the transport engineering cluster. On the other hand, construction adding 8.5%, extending the 10% growth in the previous quarter on a pickup in both public and private sector construction activities. Meanwhile, services growing by 1.8% against 4% in the quarter before. Only the wholesale and retail trade cluster declined among the services producing industries in Q1. Alongside those official advance estimates, the Monetary Authority of Singapore leaving its monetary policy unchanged, pausing a series of tightening moves since October 2021 to fight rising inflation. The width and the midpoint of the policy band were also left unchanged. In its biannual monetary policy statement, MAS describes its current policy stance as being appropriate for securing medium-term price stability, while flagging the risk of a deeper than anticipated slowdown in the Singapore economy amid higher risks to global growth. Joining me now is Irvin Seah, Senior Economist at DBS. So Irvin, let's start with MAS's unchanged monetary policy. It's largely a surprise, with most analysts expecting another round of tightening. Could you help us further understand the rationale of MAS's decision to pause its tightening moves?
Well, first and foremost, it didn't come as a surprise to us because we had early on expected that the MAS will stand pat and it will pause on this current tightening cycle. Now, there are a few reasons for doing that. The most important thing is that inflation, although it is still a concern, but it is no longer as big a concern as compared to growth, because ultimately the mandate of the central bank is to strike a balance between inflation and growth. And what we have seen in today's GDP number as well, that there are certainly a picked up in terms of the downside risk to growth. So growth has weakened significantly on that. On the other hand, inflation has been a concern for the past 1 to 2 years, but inflation has peaked. In fact, it has peaked at about 7.5% in October last year, and since then, for the past few months, it has been moderating. Now that with inflation's easing off, in fact, inflation would have been even lower if not for GST. But the fact is that inflation will continue to ease off for the rest of the year and heading into 2024. So with inflationary pressure less of a concern, but now increasing focus on growth, then it makes sense for the MAS to strike a balance, to rebalance its monetary policy. Now, having said that, a lot of people had misperception that by rebalancing the MAS would have to either ease off a monetary policy. We have to be mindful that coming to a pause, the signal policy band, it is still on an upward sloping trajectory. So that means the Sing dollar is still appreciating against a basket of currency. So therefore, it is still sufficient to address any concerns pertaining to inflation while not incurring any detrimental impact on growth. Now, on that part, I also want to highlight that the stronger the Sing dollar is, the more detrimental it is on our exports as well as the manufacturing sector. And as it is now, our non-oil domestic export is already below 2020 COVID levels. So that is definitely a concern for the economy. And henceforth, there isn't any further needs to tighten monetary policy any further.
Good points there, Irvin. So moving on to those GDP figures. To reiterate, the Singapore economy growing by just 0.1% year on year, lower than expected. Any good news at all, Irvin, or are we heading for a technical recession?
Well, 0.1% on year basis is weak to begin with. Henceforth, I don't think there's anything to cheer about. In fact, if you look at a quarter-on-quarter basis, that is where the real worries lies in, because a decline of 0.7% is not a good thing. And if we do get another quarter decline in the second quarter, that essentially means that the Singapore economy is in a technical recession already. But having said that, we think that the second quarter, there could be some bounce back in the manufacturing sector, as well as the services sector. Now, manufacturing sector at this point in time is definitely in the doldrum. The manufacturing sector is in recession, so to speak. But we expect that the manufacturing cycle has hit the bottom. So in the second quarter, we'll see some improvement. And in services sector, this sector economic growth momentum is waning. However, there is outlier, and that is the hospitality sector. And this sector actually has benefited from an increase in inflows of tourist arrivals, particularly from China. Now, China's reopening has been a very important pivotal factor for Singapore economy, and we're going to see more and more such positive spillover, particularly in the second half of the year. As we see more tourists coming to Singapore, and also with growth improvement in China, it could actually provide some respite for our manufacturing sector. But in a nutshell, we expect full year GDP growth to register 2.2% this year. So definitely not a recession, but at 2.2%, we also have to be mindful that it is below the potential growth rate of 2.5% to 3.5% for Singapore. So this is definitely subpar growth, on a general basis.
Irvin, the government has estimated GDP growth of 0.5 to 2.5% for 2023. You mentioned a 2.2 estimate earlier. Could you elaborate on your take on where the GDP will fall in this rather broad range? And what do you think could help or hinder our GDP growth, domestic and external factors? You also mentioned China earlier.
Yes, correct. So I think the government is taking a very cautious approach in their estimates, which is why they maintain the forecast of 0.5 to 2.5%. But do note that actually this forecast has been, put forth, I think slightly before the reopening of China economy, before that was announced, which is in December last year. So we do expect that China's reopening basically would prompt stronger growth in China, which then in turn translate to stronger demand for Singapore's exports, and henceforth on the manufacturing sector, which is currently struggling. So this will be a lifeline for the manufacturing sector in the coming quarters. And from the services sector, right now, yes, we're seeing more Chinese tourists coming to Singapore, but it is only at 20% of pre-COVID level. So there is still definitely, a lot more headroom for the Chinese tourists in terms of arrivals. and that definitely will provide further lift to the hospitality sector in Singapore.
Your perspectives are always appreciated, Irvin. Many thanks to Irvin Sia, DBS's senior economist. Following President Halimah Yacob's speech on Monday when she spoke about the importance of strengthening mutual trust between Singaporeans and their confidence in our system of government, 4 ministries have outlined their initiatives for the rest of their term in office. There are 3 key thrusts, with the first being to partner Singaporeans in building a more united and resilient society. The Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth says it aims to work with Singaporeans through the Forward Singapore public consultation exercise to co-develop policies and solutions for youth to shape Singapore. The Prime Minister's office aims to use technology to foster a sense of community, while the Law Ministry will partner stakeholders to maximize the potential and unlock the value of state properties. MinLaw will also aim to improve access to justice and legal services for all Singaporeans, as it works towards the second key thrust of enabling a high-performing, trusted public service. The Ministry of Finance says it will continue providing sound and stable public finances for Singapore through a sustainable mix of taxes, while PMO will place greater emphasis on competency development for public officers. PMO also says it will facilitate greater data sharing with non-government entities and scale up smart solutions as it looks to leverage technology to build a people-centric and future-ready government. The ministry will also deepen expertise in key science and technology areas across the public service. In other news, Carl Liu, the son of Changi Airport Group's former chairman Liu Man Leong, has been jailed for 2 weeks for lying to a district judge in an earlier trial. Liu had pleaded guilty to 1 count of giving false information to a public servant in the trial of his family's former maid, Ms. Party Liani. A second charge of him giving false information to the police that further incriminated Ms. Party of theft was also taken into consideration. Now, Ms. Party had been convicted in 2019 of stealing $30,000 worth of items from the Lius before the sentence was overturned on appeal in 2020. The police are rolling out a new initiative to give victims of sexual crimes priority and greater privacy when they file reports at all neighbourhood police centres from this month. Known as the Sexual Crime Report option, victims can indicate at the queue management kiosks that they are reporting a sexual crime. This will immediately alert officers, and the victims will be given a private space during the interviews. Speaking at the Sexual Crime Awareness Seminar, Law Minister K. Shanmugam says he hopes the increased support will make it easier for victims to report sexual crimes. The police also revealing that at least 113 Android phone users had their banking credentials stolen in phishing scams since March. Officials adding that victims have lost at least $445,000. Police say victims were scammed after responding to advertisements marketing home services or the sale of food items on social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram or WhatsApp. They were then redirected to download an app to book the services or make their purchase. Now, these apps contained malware that allowed scammers access to the victims' bank credentials and SMS one-time passwords. The authorities are advising that the public download apps only from official app stores and update their devices with the latest security patches. Meanwhile, WhatsApp will add a range of new security features over the next few months that will aim to make it more difficult for hackers to take over users' accounts. These tools include extra checks to ascertain that people are who they say they are, as well as tools to ensure hackers aren't able to install malware to access users' personal messages. Well, those are our top stories today. Visit straitstimes.com for more news and our YouTube channel. For more videos, subscribe by hitting the red button below. I'm Olivia Quay. Have a good weekend and see you next week on The Big Story.